Wow. Um, you weren't kidding when you said you wanted to do a deep dive on Napoleon.
Yeah.
It's a lot. We've got excerpts from a biography and an index. I mean, the works, this is going to be great.
It is remarkable, though, isn't it? I mean, just the amount of material written about this one guy centuries after he died. I mean,
Right.
it really shows you how much of an impact he had.
Yeah. And you know what? Just looking through all the stuff you sent me, there are already some surprises popping up.
Oh,
Yeah, like you wouldn't think that growing up on an island would be the best way to prepare for conquering Europe. But it seems like Napoleon's Corsican roots really mattered.
hmm.
But then there's this tension between like his island identity and his ambition in mainland France.
Yeah, that is interesting. It is the paradox.
Yeah.
We tend to oversimplify figures like Napoleon, like
Mm-hmm.
the conqueror, the emperor. But when you look at his early life, you see a much more complex person shaped by Corsica.
And speaking of complex, the biography goes into how he was the strategic genius, but he also made some pretty big mistakes.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you go from conquering Europe to getting stuck in Spain?
Well, that's where the human element comes in, I guess. You can be a military genius, but that doesn't mean you make perfect decisions every time. And Spain is a perfect example of how things like nationalism can totally derail even the most well-planned campaigns. And that's something we're still dealing with today.
So let's go back to the beginning, to Corsica. The biography paints a picture of Napoleon's family as not exactly royalty. They were minor nobility, and their relationship with the Corsican leader, Paoli, was complicated, to say the least.
Yeah, and understanding that relationship with Paoli is really important. If you want to understand Napoleon, here you have this young guy who's completely immersed in Corsican patriotism, but at the same time, he's super influenced by guys like Rousseau, who had this vision of a more just and equal society. And so these competing ideas playing out on this tiny island, they end up shaping Napoleon's views on power and ambition and even his own identity.
It's almost like he was constantly being pulled in two different directions. His Corsican heritage on one side, and then this desire for something bigger on a grander stage.
Exactly. And that tension, you can see it fueling his early military career. So on one hand, being Corsican gives him opportunities in the French army.
Yeah.
But then on the other hand, he's dealing with resentment and prejudice from those who see him as an outsider. Just some provincial nobody.
The biography even says that he took advantage of loopholes in the military system just so he could visit Corsica. He was already figuring out how to bend the rules to get what he wanted, even back then.
Yeah, and you have to remember that this was a crazy time in France. The revolution had completely flipped the social order on its head, which created both chaos and opportunity. And in this kind of environment, ambition and ruthlessness, those were often rewarded. Napoleon was a quick learner. He knew how to play the game in those dangerous waters.
One thing that really stood out to me was his relationship with Paoli. I mean, they went from being allies to being enemies. It's almost like a Shakespearean tragedy. The mentor betrayed by his protege.
Yeah, that break with Paoli, it was a turning point. It wasn't just a personal thing. It represents a fundamental shift in how Napoleon understood power. He realized that sentimentality and loyalty have limits, and sometimes being ruthless is the only way to get what you want.
And you see that pragmatic, almost Machiavellian approach throughout his whole career. There's a part in the index that talks about how, even early on, he wasn't afraid to blame others when he failed, or to manipulate situations to his advantage. He instinctively knew how important it was to control how people saw things.
Yeah, and don't forget, this was a time when information traveled slowly and reputations could be made or destroyed really easily. Napoleon understood the power of perception, maybe more than a lot of people at the time.
Yeah.
He knew how important it was to shape how people saw him and the things he did.
It makes you wonder, was he just power hungry by nature, or was he just a product of his time, a guy who learned to play dirty because that's what you had to do to survive and get ahead in the middle of a revolution?
That's the million-dollar question. And honestly, it's something historians are still arguing about.
Right.
It's hard to separate Napoleon's personality from the crazy time he lived in.
Yeah. And this leads us to a chapter that really grabbed my attention. The Egyptian campaign. On paper, it seemed brilliant. Early victories, control of this key trade route, and then it all falls apart. He even abandoned his troops and went back to France.
Ah, Egypt. That's the perfect example of how Napoleon's brilliance could be mixed up with recklessness and even a disregard for the people under his command. But he also shows you how incredibly good he was at turning even his defeats into wins.
So how did he do it? How did he spin losing in Egypt into a power move back in France?
Propaganda.
Yeah.
He controlled every bit of information coming out of Egypt, highlighting the victories, downplaying the setbacks. And then, when he goes back to France, he presents himself as the hero, The savior who abandoned a lost cause to rescue the nation from falling apart.
So basically, even his failures somehow ended up helping him, adding to his mystique and helping him rise to power.
You got it. And that's something we'll see over and over throughout his career. He understood that how things appear is often more important than how they actually are, and he was a master at manipulating both.
He was so good at turning things to his advantage, it's almost like he had a superpower.
Hmm.
And that leads us up to, I'd say, the most important moment in his life, the coup of 18 Brumaire. It wasn't just about military power, it was like a political chess game. And Napoleon, he was grandmaster.
Oh yeah, it's a textbook example of how to grab power. Napoleon, he used his military reputation, his popularity with the people, and his understanding of politics to outmaneuver everyone and take control.
The index mentions this guy, Sias, a big player in the revolution.
Right.
He was supposed to be working with Napoleon, but it sounds like Napoleon had his own agenda the whole time.
CIs. He was brilliant politically, but he totally underestimated Napoleon's ambition. He thought he could use Napoleon to stabilize the government and then control things from behind the scenes. But Napoleon was thinking way ahead. He used CIs to make himself look legit, and then he basically pushed CIs out of the picture and took all the power for himself.
It's that same pattern again, using people to get what he wants and then ditching them when they're no longer useful.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty cynical way to look at it,
Yeah.
but I can't say it's not true. And it shows you how ruthless he could be, which might be hard for us to stomach, but in the world of post-revolutionary France, it was probably how you stayed alive.
Okay, so he becomes Emperor Napoleon. Now, there's no denying how brilliant he was militarily, but the biography also suggests that he wasn't exactly a saint. So how did those less desirable traits show up once he was in charge?
Napoleon as emperor. He was full of contradictions. He was a brilliant military mind, able to plan and carry out these massively complex campaigns that spanned entire continents. He reformed the French legal system, modernized the bureaucracy, and he really fostered the sense of national pride. But he also micromanaged everything. He had to know every single detail, and he got more and more autocratic as time went on.
The book says he could be incredibly charming and charismatic, but he also had a pretty low opinion of women. He didn't really see them as equals, did he?
That's a good point. And it's something that might surprise people today, you know. Even though Napoleon had these revolutionary ideas in some areas, when it came to gender roles, he was stuck in the past. He might have had deep affection for certain women, like Josephine, but at the end of the day, he saw them as supporting characters in his story, not as equals who shared his power. And unfortunately, that narrow view influenced some of his choices.
Let's talk about the empire. He conquered most of Europe. His army seemed unstoppable. What was the secret to his military success?
Napoleon's genius wasn't just in his tactics, but in how he innovated and adapted. He perfected this thing called the central position, where he would concentrate his forces and then attack the enemy's weakest point. He was all about speed and maneuverability. He would constantly outpace and outmaneuver his opponents.
The book talks about the Grande Armée, the sheer size of it, hundreds of thousands of men. Can you imagine trying to keep an army that big fed and equipped?
It's mind-boggling. The logistics were insane. Napoleon came up with this system of corps. These were self-contained units that could operate on their own and live off the land, which made them really flexible and fast. He also standardized equipment and training, which created a much more unified and effective fighting force.
But even the Grande Armée had its limits, right? The more he expanded, the more vulnerable he became.
Absolutely. Napoleon's ambition. It was both his greatest strength and his biggest weakness. It led to his downfall. The bigger his empire got, the harder it was to control. His supply lines got stretched too thin, his troops were exhausted, and his enemies just got more and more determined to fight back.
And then there's the continental system. His attempt to cripple Britain's economy.
Right.
Wasn't that a bit of a miscalculation?
The continental system? It was a good idea in theory,
Mm-hmm.
but it didn't work out so well. Napoleon wanted to choke off Britain's economy by blocking all trade between Britain and Europe. But it ended up hurting the economies of France and its allies because they depended on trade with Britain, and it led to a lot of resentment and smuggling.
And then there's Spain. From what I read about his intervention there, it was a complete disaster. He thought it would be a quick win, and it turned into a nightmare.
Oh yeah, Spain is a classic example of how Napoleon underestimated the power of nationalism. The Spanish people fought tooth and nail against the French occupation, and they used guerrilla warfare, which totally threw Napoleon's armies for a loop.
Guerrilla warfare, that was kind of new back then, right?
Yeah.
Imagine being a French soldier trained for traditional battles, and then suddenly you're fighting an enemy that disappears into the civilian population, strikes out of nowhere, and then vanishes. It's been terrifying.
Guerrilla warfare. It changed everything. It turned the occupied territories into this constant drain on French resources and manpower, and it really weakened Napoleon's control over huge chunks of his empire. It just goes to show that even the most brilliant military minds can be defeated if they're fighting the wrong kind of war.
So these cracks in Napoleon's supposedly unbeatable empire, they were starting to get bigger, and from what I've read, things were about to go from bad to worse for him.
Yeah, it feels like we're at this turning point. Up until now, it's all been about victory and conquest. But now with Spain draining his resources and his control slipping away, it seems like things are about to change. Big time.
Yeah, you're right. And the
Yeah.
thing that really caused his downfall, the event that completely destroyed his image of being invincible, it was the Russian campaign in 1812.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
The book does not sugarcoat it. The scale of the invasion, the supply line stretched way too thin, the brutal Russian winter. It's scary. It was a total disaster.
Yeah.
And during that campaign, you see all of Napoleon's weaknesses come out. His arrogance, his overconfidence, his inability to adapt when things went wrong. He had conquered most of Europe, but Russia was a whole different ballgame.
It says here that he even ignored warnings from his own advisors.
Hmm.
Some of them thought invading Russia was insane, but Napoleon wouldn't listen.
He thought he was invincible. He'd beaten the odds so many times before. Why not again? But Russia wasn't just another battle. It was this massive, unforgiving land that could just swallow armies whole.
The way the author describes the retreat from Moscow, it's chilling. Thousands of soldiers dying from hunger and cold and disease. It really shows you the human cost of Napoleon's ambition.
It was a turning point, not just for the Napoleonic Wars, but for Napoleon himself. The myth of his invincibility was gone, and his enemies, they saw that he was weak, and they took advantage.
The book says that Austria and Prussia, they were his allies, but they switched sides and joined the coalition against him.
Yeah.
Like something out of Shakespeare. The guy at the top, betrayed by the people he thought he could trust.
Betrayal. It played a big role in Napoleon's downfall. Talleyrand, his own foreign minister, had been working against him in secret for years, trying to bring back the Bourbon monarchy. And then there were others who saw which way the wind was blowing and just looked out for themselves, ditching Napoleon to save their own skins.
So, it wasn't just losing battles that brought him down. It was this loss of trust. The feeling that he couldn't even count on the people closest to him.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just pressure from the outside either. There was unrest growing within France. People were tired of all the wars. The economy was a mess. And even the peasants who had always supported Napoleon, they were getting restless.
His first abdication, exiled to Elba, that must have been humiliating. But the book says that some people stayed loyal to him, including a number of women who were important in his life.
Even when he was defeated, Napoleon still had this way of drawing people in. He could inspire incredible devotion, even fanaticism. And the women who stuck with him through exile and hardship, they give you a glimpse into this really complex and often contradictory man.
But he wasn't finished yet. The 100 Days, Waterloo, he made one last attempt to get back on top.
The 100 Days, it was an amazing but ultimately doomed chapter. He escapes from Elba, rallies his supporters, and marches on Paris. He took back the throne almost as fast as he lost it. It just shows you how charismatic he was and how much loyalty he still commanded.
But at Waterloo, he was facing all of Europe. They were determined to end his reign for good.
Waterloo was immense. Napoleon had his moments, but he was outmatched and outmaneuvered. It marked the end of an era and the beginning of Napoleon's final chapter, exile to St. Helena.
A lonely end for a man who once ruled most of Europe. What was life like for him on St. Helena?
St. Helena was Napoleon's prison. Isolated and a place to think, he spent his last years writing his memoirs, trying to shape how people would remember him and complaining about his captors. It was a far cry from the splendor of his imperial court, but even alone, he was still a captivating figure.
So what's the takeaway here? How do we, centuries later, understand this complicated guy? Brilliant military strategist, ruthless dictator, tragic hero. He seems to be all of those things and more.
That's what makes Napoleon so interesting, isn't it? He's hard to define. He was a man of his time, incredibly talented and ambitious, who rose to power. But he was also flawed, arrogant, and ultimately brought down by his own ambition.
This has been an incredible deep dive. We've covered a lot, but it feels like we've barely scratched the surface. The thing that really stuck with me was Napoleon's relationship with Paoli and how that shaped his views on power. It makes you wonder, how much of his life was determined by what happened to him early on in Corsica?
That's a good question. It makes you think about how much our past shapes our present, how those events and relationships when we're young can have such a huge impact on the course of our lives.
And that's what's so great about doing a deep dive like this. We've given you the basics, some key insights, and interesting facts, But it doesn't end there. There's so much more to discover about Napoleon's life. Keep digging into the sources, explore different perspectives, and come to your own conclusions. What about this complex figure speaks to you? What questions are you left with? We'd love to hear what you think. Thanks for joining us on this journey.